The man who promised "I'll be back" can barely walk forward anymore, requiring a cane he hides just outside camera frames. His spine fused from multiple surgeries that left him 4 inches shorter than his bodybuilding peak. Arnold Schwarzenegger, who defined masculine power from Conan to Terminator to Governor, now takes 15 medications daily for a heart that's been rebuilt 3 times, admits he sees his Nazi father's face in every mirror, and hasn't been able to feel his left leg properly since his 2022 surgery went wrong. Behind that Austrian oak exterior lies a man whose affair destroyed his family in the most public way possible, whose secret son was raised in his own home by the housekeeper he was paying for silence, and who spent decades injecting substances that are now killing him organ by organ. What you're about to discover will shatter the image of the ultimate alpha male, a man whose every muscle was built on childhood trauma he's never escaped. If Arnold ever made you believe in strength, leave a like and subscribe below. There's a moment in Arnold Schwarzenegger's childhood that explains everything. Watching his father Gustav, drunk on schnapps at 3 a.m., force him and his brother Meinhard to compete in push-up contests, the loser getting beaten with his police belt while the winner watched, learning that love was earned through dominance and family meant competition. Long before the world would know him as the Terminator, he was Arnold Alois Schwarzenegger, born July 30, 1947 in Thal, Austria, 2 years after World War II ended, to Gustav, a Nazi brown shirt turned police chief who never spoke of the war, and Aurelia, who suffered from a heart condition that would kill her and that Arnold inherited. The post-war Austrian household was a prison of silence about Gustav's Nazi past and violence about everything else. Gustav's parenting was systematic brutality disguised as discipline. He'd wake the boys at dawn for calisthenics in the snow, forcing them to exercise until vomiting, calling weakness Jewish softness that needed beating out. He openly favored Meinhard, the older, blonder son who looked properly Aryan, while Arnold's darker features reminded Gustav of something he'd never specify. Father believed in improvement through pain, Arnold would later reflect in therapy. Every beating was love, every bruise was caring. I learned that suffering meant someone was paying attention. The competition between brothers was Gustav's entertainment. He'd make them box until blood, race until collapse, compete for food portions at dinner. The loser slept in the unheated cellar. When Arnold cried after losing, Gustav would beat him harder for showing weakness. Meinhard, older and initially stronger, won everything until Arnold discovered bodybuilding at 14. "Muscles became my armor," Arnold explained. "Every pound gained was protection against father, against Meinhard, against feeling anything." School was Arnold's first taste of being different and hating it. Kids mocked his size, calling him Austrian oak, sarcastically, before he made it reality. Teachers complained he was aggressive, not understanding he was performing learned behavior. He'd been taught that domination equaled affection, that violence was communication. When a teacher asked about his bruises, Arnold lied, protecting Gustav, because even brutal attention was better than abandonment. "I learned to smile while bleeding," Arnold reflected. Performance started with pretending home was normal. His mother Aurelia's response was medicated absence. She took pills for her heart condition that made her distant, spending days in bed while Gustav terrorized the boys. When Arnold tried telling her about the beatings, she'd say, "Your father works hard. Be grateful." She'd watch Gustav pit the brothers against each other, never intervening, occasionally placing bets on who would win. "Mother loved us like spectators, loved gladiators," Arnold understood later, entertained by our suffering, but not responsible for it. The escape into bodybuilding wasn't just physical, but psychological. The gym became the one place where pain had purpose, where suffering produced visible results. Arnold would sneak out at night to train, preferring weights to family, iron to emotions. When Gustav discovered the bodybuilding magazines hidden under Arnold's bed, he burned them, calling his son homosexual for looking at male bodies. He couldn't understand that I wasn't looking at them, Arnold explained. I was looking at who I could become, someone too strong to hurt. The boy learning that fathers were enemies, mothers were absent, and brothers were competition would become the man who dominated everything, because domination was the only love language he'd been taught. At 21, Arnold Schwarzenegger stood in Munich's train station in 1968 with a single suitcase and gym bag, having gone AWOL from the Austrian army to compete in his first Mr. Universe competition. Facing military prison when he returned, but unable to resist the stage that promised escape from Austria's suffocation. He'd been training in a frozen gym with broken equipment, eating 5,000 calories daily on a soldier's salary that barely covered protein, injecting steroids he bought from veterinary suppliers because human grade was unaffordable. He was sleeping in the gym's storage room, doing bricklaying work between training sessions, sending what little money he earned back to Aurelia because Gustav had drunk himself deeper into rage. There was no plan B, Arnold would later admit. Either bodybuilding saved me, or Austria buried me like my brother. Those first years in Munich were exercises in controlled starvation and strategic steroids. Arnold would eat 20 eggs daily when he could afford them, stolen meat from restaurants where he washed dishes, protein powder mixed with water because milk was luxury. The steroids, Dianabol, Primobolan, testosterone from veterinarians, were destroying his organs while building his muscles. But 19-year-old Arnold believed dying huge was better than living small. He'd train 6 hours daily, work construction 8 hours, sleep 4, repeat. I was a machine running on rage and chemicals, Arnold reflected. Every rep was revenge against Gustav. Every pose was proving I deserved to exist. The breakthrough from nobody to somebody came through Joe Weider, the Canadian bodybuilding promoter who saw Arnold win Mr. Universe at 20 and offered him passage to America, not from charity but calculation. Weider needed someone to dethrone Sergio Oliva, the Cuban champion dominating American bodybuilding. Arnold was raw potential Weider could mold, a Nazi's son who could be repackaged as American dream. The deal was slavery disguised as opportunity, $100 weekly allowance, controlled housing, managed appearances, ownership of Arnold's image. Weider owned me like Gustav never could, Arnold understood later. But American prison was better than Austrian freedom. The 1969 arrival in Los Angeles was culture shock that Arnold hid behind broken English and perfect muscles. He lived in a tiny apartment with another bodybuilder, Franco Columbu, sharing a bed, cooking on a hot plate, walking everywhere because cars were impossible. Americans mocked his accent, his name, his foreignness. Casting directors said he'd never succeed in entertainment. Too foreign, too huge, too strange. He was Arnold Strong in his first film because Schwarzenegger was too Nazi. I was everything America didn't want, Arnold reflected, which made me work harder to become everything they'd have to accept. But fate's strangest gift was meeting Maynard's death with opportunity. In 1971, his brother died in a drunk driving accident, racing cars like he'd raced for Gustav's approval, dying at 24 from the same alcoholism that claimed their father. Arnold didn't attend the funeral. He was competing for Mr. Olympia, choosing muscles over mourning. A year later, Gustav died from a stroke, and Arnold skipped that funeral too, claiming no money for airfare but really having no grief for the man who'd made him monstrous. They died while I was becoming, Arnold said. Every death freed me to become bigger. The transformation from Austrian nobody to American. Somebody took 7 Mr. Olympia titles, Each one chemical experiment on his body, each victory costing organs he wouldn't miss until later. By 1975, Arnold had conquered bodybuilding, but discovered muscles didn't translate to respect, just spectacle. He was a circus act, not success. The man who'd escaped Austria through size would have to escape size through acting. But first he'd have to learn English properly, lose the accent that marked him foreign, and somehow convince Hollywood that a Nazi's son could be American hero. The role of Conan the Barbarian wasn't supposed to launch Arnold Schwarzenegger's acting career. He was cast because they needed someone physically massive who worked cheap, and Arnold's $250,000 fee was nothing compared to real actors. Director John Milius wanted someone who looked like they could actually swing a broadsword and survive, not knowing Arnold had been swinging iron since 14 to survive his father. Arnold had 18 months to prepare, transforming his bodybuilding physique into functional strength, learning sword work, horse riding, and somehow making grunts sound like dialogue. "I wasn't playing Conan," Arnold later admitted. "I was playing every revenge fantasy I'd had about Gustav, just with better weapons." Behind the scenes, Arnold's preparation was method acting through muscle memory. He lived on the set in Spain, sleeping in Conan's furs, eating the character's diet of meat and vegetables, maintaining character even when cameras weren't rolling, because breaking meant remembering he was just a bodybuilder pretending. The sword training triggered sense memories of Gustav's beatings, the weight of weapons, the anticipation of impact, the need to strike first. "Every sword fight was me killing my father," Arnold revealed in therapy decades later. Therapeutic, but profitable. The physical demands nearly killed him. Arnold did his own stunts because stunt doubles couldn't match his size, resulting in real injuries hidden from production. He was bitten by the camels, kicked by horses, and during the famous wheel-pushing scene, actually tore his shoulder, but kept pushing because Conan wouldn't stop for pain. The crucifixion scene left permanent nerve damage in his arms from hanging for hours. "Pain was acting," Arnold explained. "If it hurt, it was real. If it was real, maybe I was too." When Conan the Barbarian, released in 1982, Arnold's limited dialogue but overwhelming presence transformed him from curiosity to commodity. Critics mocked his acting but couldn't deny his screen presence. The film earned $130 million globally, proving muscles could make money. But standing at the premiere, watching himself destroy enemies on screen, Arnold felt nothing except his dead father's voice calling him primitive. The success triggered not celebration, but deeper steroid use, as if getting bigger could finally silence Gustav's ghost. But even at this pinnacle moment, darkness crept through success. The steroids were destroying Arnold's heart, the genetic condition from Aurelia accelerated by chemicals. He'd have chest pains during training, dismissed as muscle strain. His kidneys were failing from diuretics. His liver was processing more chemistry than food. "Success was killing me literally," Arnold reflected. "But dying famous seemed better than living anonymous." The transformation from bodybuilder to action star was complete, but costly. Arnold had proven Europeans could be American heroes, that accents could be advantages if you were big enough, that barely speaking could work if your presence spoke volumes. But he'd also discovered that Hollywood wanted his body, not him. They wrote roles around his limitations, few words, maximum violence, stories where foreign was acceptable because he was playing machines or barbarians. "I escaped one prison for another," Arnold understood. Instead of Gustav saying I wasn't enough, now Hollywood said it, just with bigger paychecks. The role that made him bankable also trapped him, forever playing variations of primitive strength, violent solutions, characters who communicated through destruction. But Arnold had a plan that nobody suspected. He was secretly taking business courses at UCLA. investing his earnings in real estate, building an empire beyond entertainment. The bodybuilder who everyone dismissed as stupid was actually calculating every move, understanding that muscles were depreciating assets, but money could buy power. The Austrian oak was about to become American success story, but first he'd have to survive the chemicals he'd used to build the body that built the career. By 1991, Arnold Schwarzenegger wasn't just an action star. He was Hollywood's most bankable leading man, commanding $15 million for Terminator 2, plus percentage of gross that would earn him $75 million total, making him the highest-paid actor in history. His real estate investments were worth $200 million. He'd married Maria Shriver, connecting him to American royalty through the Kennedys, and their 4 children seemed to prove he'd broken the cycle of abuse. The Nazi's son from Austria had become California's favorite immigrant. Republicans wanted him in politics, and Democrats accepted him through Maria. But even at this impossible peak, Arnold was taking 40 pills daily. Steroids for size, beta blockers for his deteriorating heart, painkillers for injuries that never healed, and antidepressants for depression he called Austrian melancholy. The public saw endless triumph. Terminator 2 becoming the highest-grossing film of 1991. Total Recall proving he could carry complex narratives. Kindergarten Cop showing unexpected comedy range. But privately, Arnold was maintaining impossible standards through chemistry and compulsion. He'd wake at 4 a.m. for 2-hour workouts, despite being 44, with joints grinding bone on bone. He'd inject steroids between takes, hiding the needles in his trailer. His heart condition, bicuspid aortic valve from Olympia, was worsening from decades of abuse, requiring medication that fought the steroids that maintained his image. Success meant never admitting decline, Arnold reflected. Every role required me to be 30 when I was pushing 50. The marriage to Maria was political alliance more than romance. She needed someone who wasn't another Kennedy man destroyed by privilege. He needed American legitimacy that came with American royalty. They lived in separate wings of their Brentwood mansion, scheduling intimacy like summit meetings, raising children through nannies while both pursued careers. Maria tolerated his affairs, the groping incidents on sets, the mistresses in hotels, because divorce would damage both brands. We were merger, not marriage, Arnold later admitted. Kennedy ambition meeting Austrian ambition, producing photogenic children. Working with directors like James Cameron and Paul Verhoeven, Arnold had transcended mockery to become institution. But the control required was destroying him. He'd memorize everyone's lines because his dyslexia made reading difficult. He'd rehearse simple dialogue hundreds of times, the accent that made him famous also limiting him to specific phrases that worked with his pronunciation. Between films, he was building political connections, learning policy, preparing for what nobody thought possible, an Austrian bodybuilder becoming American governor. Acting was just funding for the real performance, Arnold explained. Politics, where I could be more than muscles. Success is isolation perfected, Arnold told his therapist during this period. Everyone sees Terminator, Conan, the characters. Nobody sees Arnold, and Arnold is dying inside the costume. By 1995, at the absolute peak of his powers, Arnold Schwarzenegger had everything measurable. Wealth beyond imagination, fame beyond borders, a family that photographed perfectly. But he also had a heart requiring surgery he kept postponing, a marriage that was performance, and the exhausting maintenance of being Arnold, the strongest man alive, when his body was failing from everything he'd done to build it. The crack showed only to those who looked. The tremor in his hands between takes from neurological damage, the nitroglycerin pills he'd take before action sequences to prevent cardiac events, The affairs with household staff that were power exercised because power was all he understood. Gustav had taught him domination was love, and Arnold dominated everything: box office, politics, women. But domination isn't connection, and connection was what he'd never learned. The man who'd built himself into perfection was about to discover that even perfect machines eventually break down. Arnold's marriage to Maria Shriver in 1986 began as calculated merger between American royalty and Austrian ambition. She was Kennedy nobility seeking someone who wasn't weakened by inherited privilege. He was an immigrant needing legitimacy that came with Camelot connection. They married at St. Francis Xavier Catholic Church in Hyannis with Oprah Winfrey as bridesmaid and the Kennedy compound as reception venue. Arnold knowing he was marrying into American history, Maria knowing she was marrying managed scandal. Their prenuptial agreement was 60 pages of financial firewalls and behavioral clauses, including provisions for discretionary conduct that essentially permitted affairs if they remained discreet. "We weren't romantic partners," Maria would later tell friends. "We were strategic allies with shared offspring." The marriage's structure was corporate rather than intimate. They maintained separate schedules, separate bedrooms, separate lives that intersected for public events and procreation. 4 children arrived on schedule: Catherine in 1989, Christina in 1991, Patrick in 1993, Christopher in 1997, each time between Arnold's films like production schedules. Maria raised them essentially alone while Arnold worked, trained, or campaigned, appearing for photo opportunities but absent for daily life. "I had 4 children with a visiting celebrity," Maria reflected. "He'd show up for birthdays like guest appearances." The systematic infidelity wasn't secret, just unacknowledged. Arnold groped women on sets, had mistresses in every filming location, and treated sex like another form of domination Gustav had taught him. The household staff knew to look away, sign NDAS, and accept that serving Arnold meant serving his appetites. When Mildred Baena, the housekeeper, became pregnant in 1996, nobody questioned the timing coinciding with Maria's pregnancy with Christopher. Arnold collected women like trophies, a former staff member revealed, not from desire, but from proving he could. The revelation of Joseph Baena, Arnold's son with Mildred, who looked exactly like him, didn't come through confession, but through visibility. As Joseph grew, his resemblance became undeniable. Maria discovered the truth in 2011, when Joseph was 14, not through Arnold admitting it, but through seeing the boy's face and knowing. The confrontation was Kennedy cold. Maria didn't scream or cry, just began separation procedures with the efficiency of political campaign. 25 years of marriage ended with Maria looking at me like I was exactly what she'd always known I was, Arnold reflected. Gustav with better PR. But the deeper damage was to the children. Catherine became therapist and social activist, channeling trauma into helping others. Christina struggled with Adderall addiction, seeking chemical perfection like her father. Patrick dealt with drinking and car accidents, inheriting Arnold's self-destruction. Christopher, the youngest, withdrew completely, the invisible child in a visible family. Meanwhile, Joseph, the affair child, thrived, becoming a bodybuilder and actor, essentially becoming Arnold, while the legitimate children struggled with being Schwarzeneggers. "I destroyed my family the way Gustav destroyed his," Arnold realized. Different methods, same damage. Love for me was ownership, Arnold finally understood in therapy at 70. Gustav owned us through violence. I own people through power. But ownership isn't love, and power isn't connection. The divorce settlement cost Arnold $375 million, half his fortune. But the real cost was the children who looked at him like Maria did, seeing exactly who he'd always been, just with better muscles and political power. The man who'd played machines discovered he'd become one, programmed by childhood trauma to repeat patterns, to dominate rather than love, to perform family rather than be family. In 1997, during filming of Batman and Robin, Arnold Schwarzenegger collapsed on set from what was initially hidden as exhaustion, but was actually his first heart valve failure, requiring emergency surgery that replaced his bicuspid aortic valve, the genetic defect from Olympia that he'd accelerated through 40 years of steroid abuse. The surgery was supposed to be routine, but Arnold technically died on the table for 4 minutes, experiencing what he later described as meeting Gustav in hell, both of us finally equal in death. He woke up weaker than he'd been since childhood, his chest cracked open, depending on machines, the strongest man in Hollywood suddenly mortal. My heart literally broke, Arnold reflected, the organ and the metaphor simultaneously. The exact medical reality was decades of accumulated damage presenting its bill. The steroids hadn't just built muscle. They'd enlarged his heart to dangerous dimensions, thickened arterial walls, and stressed the already defective valve until it failed. His kidneys were functioning at 40% from diuretics. His liver showed scarring from processing industrial amounts of chemicals. His joints were bone on bone from lifting weights that human frames weren't designed for. I was a walking autopsy, Arnold told his surgeon. Still moving, but already dead in parts. The second surgery in 2018 was supposed to be routine valve replacement, but complications nearly killed him again. Arnold woke up with internal bleeding, requiring emergency return to surgery. Then came the third procedure in 2020, another valve failure during COVID, when hospitals were overwhelmed. This time, Arnold prepared final messages for his children, convinced he wouldn't survive. 3 strikes at the heart, he observed. Like God was targeting where I was already broken. Each surgery left him weaker, the recovery longer, the return to normal more impossible. The psychological impact was devastating for someone whose identity was physical dominance. Arnold couldn't lift weights for months, watching muscles he'd spent 50 years building atrophy in weeks. He required help walking, showering, basic functions that made him feel like the weak child Gustav had beaten. The depression was crushing. Not Austrian melancholy, but genuine despair at losing the only identity he'd ever valued. Without muscles, who was I? Arnold asked his therapist. Just another old Nazi's son with a bad heart. Recovery became about accepting limitations Arnold had never acknowledged. He could still train, but with weights that wouldn't challenge teenagers. His heart medication made him tired, conflicted with supplements he'd taken for decades, required constant monitoring. He needed afternoon naps, couldn't handle stress, had to avoid the intense training that had defined him. The Terminator needed terminate dates for activity. I became what I'd mocked, Arnold reflected. Weak, limited, mortal, everything Gustav said I was. The surgeries weren't just medical, Arnold understood. They were excavations of everything I'd done to survive Gustav. The chemicals, the punishment, the impossible standards. My heart was failing because I'd never actually had one. Just a pump I'd abused, like Gustav abused me. The man who'd promised I'll be back discovered that coming back from heart surgery 3 times meant coming back as someone different, smaller, weaker, more human. At 77, Arnold's daily routine involved more pills than proteins, more cardio monitoring than muscle building. The Austrian oak had become driftwood, still shaped by what he'd been, but hollow inside, waiting for the next wave to either carry or break him. The call came at 4:30 a.m. on August 13, 1998, while Arnold was governing California, echo his assistant speaking carefully. Your mother Aurelia has died from a heart attack in Graz. She was 76, dying from the same genetic heart condition she'd passed to Arnold. alone in the Austrian house where Gustav had terrorized them all. Arnold didn't attend the funeral. He was signing legislation, choosing politics over goodbye, repeating his pattern of missing family deaths for career moments. She died like she lived, Arnold reflected years later, quietly, asking for nothing, in the shadow of louder violence. But Aurelia's death revealed darker truths Arnold had never confronted. Going through her belongings, he found letters from Gustav during the war, photographs of his father in Nazi uniform at camps, whose names Arnold recognized, documentation that Gustav hadn't been peripheral, but actively involved. His mother had saved evidence of the monster she'd married, hidden it from the children, died keeping secrets that might have explained the violence. My mother protected us from knowing, but not from being, Arnold realized. We lived with a war criminal who brought the war home. The parallel losses had already accumulated. Meinhard died in 1971, drunk driving at 24, racing toward death like it was finish line. Gustav followed in 1972, stroke taking him while Arnold competed for Mr. Olympia, choosing muscles over mourning. Franco Columbu, his only real friend, died in 2019, drowning at 78. The one person who knew Arnold before America, before fame, when he was just scared Austrian kid sleeping in gyms. Everyone who knew me before I became Arnold is dead, he reflected. I'm the only witness to my own becoming. But the loss that broke Arnold completely was Patrick's overdose in 2022. His son surviving, but barely, found unconscious in his apartment, having inherited both Arnold's addictive personality and the trauma of being Schwarzenegger. Patrick had been using Xanax, Adderall, and alcohol, the same chemical management Arnold had used, just different substances. I gave my son my genetics and my damage, Arnold told Maria at the hospital. He's destroying himself the way I did, just faster, more efficiently. The family fracture from Joseph's revelation had never healed. Catherine barely spoke to Arnold. Christina was in and out of rehab. Christopher disappeared into privacy. Meanwhile, Joseph thrived, posting bodybuilding photos that looked exactly like young Arnold, succeeding where legitimate children struggled. The visual was devastating, the affair child becoming Arnold, while the real children collapsed. Joseph is my punishment, Arnold understood, showing me what I could have been as a father if I'd been present instead of powerful. I've buried or broken everyone, Arnold reflected at 77. My parents died while I chased success. Meinhard died trying to escape what I escaped from. My children are struggling with being my children. Maria looks at me like I'm Gustav with better teeth. The governor who'd pardoned criminals couldn't pardon himself. The action hero who'd saved fictional worlds couldn't save his actual family. At 77, Arnold was the last Schwarzenegger standing from his generation, but standing on graves and broken children, the Austrian oak finally understanding that strength without love was just violence with better marketing, and he'd been sold as product for so long he'd forgotten he was supposed to be a person. By 2011, Arnold Schwarzenegger's divorce from Maria Shriver revealed financial devastation hidden behind the action hero facade. $375 million settlement, half his fortune gone, while discovering his business manager had invested millions in failing ventures without his knowledge, leaving him worth $200 million on paper, but cash poor in reality. The return to acting wasn't choice but necessity at 64, taking roles in The Expendables franchise for $3 million when he'd once commanded $25 million, playing parody of himself because that's all Hollywood wanted from a senior citizen who'd been governor. I went from running California to running after paychecks, Arnold reflected. Same accent, different desperation. The political career that was supposed to crown his American dream had actually cost him everything. Being governor paid $175,000 annually, while Arnold spent millions maintaining his image, refusing salary to seem noble while hemorrhaging wealth. His businesses suffered without his presence. Restaurants failed, real estate ventures collapsed, investment partners embezzled knowing he was too busy governing to notice. The financial advisors he'd trusted had leveraged his properties for investments in green energy companies that went bankrupt, leaving Arnold with debt on buildings he thought he owned outright. Success in politics meant failure in everything else, Arnold discovered. I governed California while my empire collapsed. Behind the scenes, Arnold's return to action films was physically humiliating. Insurance companies required extensive medical examinations, discovering the heart surgeries, the arthritis, the spine compression from decades of deadlifts. His premium costs made him expensive liability rather than box office guarantee. During Terminator Genesis, he required 4 stunt doubles, CGI enhancement, and shooting schedules accommodated around his medical needs. The famous "I'll be back," delivered by a man who could barely make it through single takes. I became expensive nostalgia, Arnold observed, like bringing dinosaurs back for one last roar. The streaming pivot revealed how far he'd fallen. Netflix's FUBAR paid him $1 million per episode. Good money but television, the medium movie stars did when movies stopped calling. Playing a CIA operative required hiding his surgical scars, his limited mobility, his need for afternoon naps between scenes. The action sequences were mostly stuntmen and CGI, Arnold's face digitally attached to younger bodies. I'm animated now, he admitted. The technology that created Terminator now creates the illusion I can still terminate. The slow reckoning came through watching contemporaries retire with dignity while he couldn't afford to stop. Stallone had rocky legacy. Willis had withdrawn gracefully before his diagnosis became public, while Arnold was doing mobile game commercials, hawking supplements, appearing at bodybuilding events for appearance fees. He sold his personal memorabilia, Terminator leather jackets, Conan swords, even his first Mr. Olympia trophy, claiming it was for charity but needing liquidity. The tank he'd bought from the Austrian army became a tourist attraction he charged people to ride. Every piece of my history has a price tag, Arnold reflected, because history doesn't pay medical bills. By 2024, Arnold Schwarzenegger was still working but questioning why. Each role required medical supervision, insurance riders that cost more than his salary, assistants who were secretly nurses. The man who'd been Hollywood's highest-paid actor was doing podcast advertisements, selling his voice for anyone who'd pay. He'd rebuilt from governor to influencer, from action hero to content creator, each evolution smaller than the last. At 77, he existed in permanent performance of vitality while managing heart failure, promoting fitness while taking 20 pills daily, promising he'd be back while knowing there was nowhere to return to. By 2024, Arnold Schwarzenegger's appearance at his own documentary premiere became uncomfortable viewing when he required assistance walking the red carpet, gripping his cane with a right hand that shook from essential tremor, while his left arm hung partially paralyzed from his latest heart surgery complications. What the public didn't know was that Arnold had been experiencing mild cognitive impairment from multiple cardiac arrests depriving his brain of oxygen, requiring cue cards for interviews, forgetting his children's names mid-conversation, sometimes believing he was still governor and asking staff about legislation that passed 15 years ago. At 77, the Terminator couldn't terminate his own decline, watching himself deteriorate in real time while pretending strength that existed only in memory. The cognitive changes manifested in heartbreaking specificity. During a recent podcast, Arnold told the same story about meeting Gustav 3 times, unaware of repetition, until the host gently redirected. He'd confuse his movies, claiming he'd fought Predator and Conan. The Terminator was documentary. The famous one-liners became jumbled. "I'll be back," becoming "back I'll be," delivered with confusion rather than confidence. When asked about his heart surgeries, he claimed they hadn't happened yet, were scheduled for next week, the temporal confusion increasing with fatigue. "My brain is terminating itself," Arnold told his neurologist. Appropriately ironic. Public response had shifted from admiration to vampiric consumption of decline. Every appearance triggered analysis of his deterioration, the tremors progression, the mobility issues, the cognitive lapses edited from interviews but leaked online. Social media dissected his every struggle, comparing current footage to peak Arnold, measuring the distance between Austrian oak and dying tree. When he appeared at Gold's Gym unable to bench press the bar, younger bodybuilders filmed it, posting with crying laughing emojis. "I've become inspiration porn for my own funeral," Arnold observed. The isolation had become complete architecture of assistance. Arnold required 24-hour care but refused to admit it, calling nurses assistants, medical equipment, furniture, his wheelchair, temporary seating. Joseph visited daily, the affair child becoming primary caregiver while legitimate children maintained distance. Catherine sent cards, Christina was in rehab again, Patrick struggled with his own sobriety. Christopher hadn't spoken to Arnold in 2 years. "I raise strangers and a son," Arnold realized. "The illegitimate one loves me, while the legitimate ones can't stand me." Recent attempts at relevance felt like self-parody. A podcast where he offered life advice while unable to remember his own. A Netflix documentary presenting edited history while reality deteriorated. Social media posts about fitness while requiring help to stand. The announcement of another Terminator film where he'd essentially be CGI puppet, his likeness licensed rather than performed. "I'm becoming my own deep fake," Arnold admitted. "The technology that made me famous now maintains the illusion I still exist." "I've become Gustav," Arnold told his therapist during a moment of clarity. "Old, angry, abandoned by children, dying from choices I made decades ago. The only difference is I documented my destruction in high definition." The work continued through momentum rather than purpose. Voice work spliced from multiple sessions, appearances where handlers moved him like machinery, content created from archive footage. At 77, Arnold Schwarzenegger existed in permanent performance of Arnold Schwarzenegger, but the performance was glitching, the machinery failing, the Austrian oak finally rotting from roots poisoned before he was born. The promise of "I'll be back" had become threat rather than reassurance. Each return smaller, weaker, less recognizable as the man who'd conquered everything except the genetics and trauma that were conquering him. Today, at 78, Arnold Schwarzenegger continues lifting weights he can barely grip, taking 23 pills daily for conditions from cardiac to cognitive, living in a Brentwood mansion filled with memorabilia from when his body worked. He rises each morning at 5 a.m., the same time Gustav woke him for punishment, takes medication including the heart pills that keep him alive and the antidepressants that make life bearable, then performs Arnold Schwarzenegger for cameras that document decline rather than dominance. His net worth remains around $400 million, but medical costs consume millions annually. He works not from need, but from terror, that stopping means admitting what he's become. Gustav with better genetics that still failed, a father who damaged his children differently but equally, a machine that ran on steroids and rage until both ran out. The truth in Arnold's story? Sometimes the strongest men are the most broken boys. The biggest muscles hide the deepest wounds. And you can conquer everything except the father in your mirror and the heart in your chest. If this moved you, Leave a like and subscribe for more stories of those who remind us that even Terminators have expiration dates.